You're kneeling on cold stone in a Roman villa at midnight, and the woman beside you isn't becoming your wife through the ceremony you thought you understood. Her hand trembles as she places it over yours on the sacred fire, but this isn't the public marriage Rome will recognize at dawn. This is something older, something the Senate has been trying to legislate out of existence for 3 centuries, something that
In this
gives women
hidden light,
property rights and
forever
legal
bound,
autonomy
my love.
that the state desperately wants to eliminate. Welcome to the hidden world of marriage by usus, the ritual that allowed Roman women to remain legally independent, and the systematic campaign to erase it. I'm about to reveal how Rome deliberately obscured one of antiquity's most radical institutions, a form of marriage that recognized women as autonomous legal persons rather than property transferred between men. This isn't the romantic version of Roman matrimony you encountered in school. This is the story of how an empire weaponized law to strip women of rights they'd held for centuries, then erased the evidence so thoroughly that modern historians barely mention it existed. Before we examine this systematic erasure, let me provide context that will reshape your understanding of Roman women's legal status. Most people imagine Roman marriage as a single institution, the paterfamilias transferring authority over his daughter to her new husband through formal ceremony. The reality was far more complex and far more threatening to male power. What I've discovered through months of research into legal texts, marriage contracts, and archaeological evidence is that for most of Rome's history, women had access to 3 distinct forms of marriage with radically different legal consequences. And the one that gave women the most autonomy, marriage by usus, was the one Rome worked hardest to destroy. The first thing you need to understand is how marriage became a battlefield for legal control. Nobody openly opposed women's autonomy in principle. Yet Roman law systematically eliminated every mechanism through which women could exercise it in practice. Usus marriage worked through cohabitation, live with a man for 1 continuous year, and you became legally married without ceremony, without state approval, without transferring legal authority from your father to your husband. You remained under your own legal control or under your birth family's authority if still underage. You could own property independently, sign contracts, conduct business, file lawsuits. All rights that vanished the moment you entered conventional manus marriage, where legal authority transferred completely to your husband. The mathematics of female autonomy were precisely calculated through these competing systems. And Rome spent 3 centuries dismantling the one that granted women independence. The daily reality of usus marriage was far from the idealized vision of Roman family life. Women who chose this path worked under constant social pressure. Male relatives called them disobedient. Husbands resented their legal independence. The Senate passed increasingly restrictive legislation designed to make usus marriages impractical or impossible. Yet women kept choosing it, kept finding ways to maintain their legal autonomy, kept resisting the patriarchal control that conventional marriage demanded. This was resistance disguised as domestic choice. Here's what the legal texts reveal when you read them carefully. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code from 450 BCE, explicitly recognized usus marriage and even provided women with an escape clause, the trinoctium or 3 nights. If a woman spent 3 consecutive nights away from her husband's home each year, the continuous cohabitation requirement reset. The marriage didn't form. She remained legally independent indefinitely. Think about what that means. Rome's oldest laws contained a mechanism specifically designed to allow women to live with male partners, share their lives, bear their children, yet retain complete legal autonomy forever. This wasn't an oversight. This was intentional legal architecture that recognized women as independent persons rather than transferable property. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Starting in the late Republic, around 100 BCE, Roman legal reforms began systematically attacking usus marriage. First, they made the trinoctium harder to exercise by requiring women to provide formal notification and witnesses. Then they restricted which women could use it. Married women, yes. But unmarried women living with partners without formal engagement faced prosecution for sexual immorality. Then they began requiring state registration of all marriages, which effectively forced usus unions into the same legal framework as conventional marriages. By the time Augustus implemented his marriage legislation in 18 BCE, usus marriage had been so thoroughly restricted that most women couldn't access it. And by the 2nd century CE, legal commentators like Gaius wrote about it in the past tense, describing it as an archaic institution that no longer exists among us. The evidence of systematic erasure becomes undeniable when you examine what survived. We have thousands of Roman legal texts. Hundreds discuss marriage in exhaustive detail, yet usus marriage receives barely 20 substantive mentions across the entire corpus of Roman law. Compare that to manus marriage, the form where husbands gained complete legal authority over wives, which appears in thousands of legal discussions, case studies, and commentaries. The silence isn't accidental, it's documentary suppression. Later Roman jurists didn't just ignore usus marriage. They actively minimized it, describing it as primitive, dangerous, socially unacceptable. One legal commentary from the 3rd century explicitly states that usus marriage was properly abolished because it allowed women to escape appropriate male authority. Read that phrase again. Escape appropriate male authority. That's not legal analysis. That's ideological enforcement disguised as jurisprudence. The text doesn't argue usus marriage created practical problems or legal complications. It argues women shouldn't have autonomy, and therefore the law that granted them autonomy deserved elimination. This is patriarchy writing its own history, celebrating the destruction of women's rights as social progress. Now understand the machinery that made this erasure possible. Roman law didn't evolve naturally toward restricting women's autonomy. It was deliberately reformed through legislative action backed by specific interest groups. Senators who wanted to control their daughters' property, husbands who resented wives with independent wealth, fathers who saw usus marriage as daughters defying paternal authority. These weren't abstract social forces. These were identifiable men passing specific laws to eliminate specific rights. The Lex Iulia of 18 BCE didn't mention usus marriage explicitly, but its requirements for legal marriage, formal ceremony, property transfer, state registration, made informal unions impossible to maintain. The Lex Papia of 9 CE imposed financial penalties on unmarried women, effectively forcing them into conventional marriage or poverty. Each reform narrowed women's options until only one form of marriage remained accessible, the form where women became legal dependents. And the legal erasure was reinforced through social pressure. Elite Roman families stopped mentioning usus marriages in their documentation. Marriage contracts from the late Republic and early Empire exclusively describe manus unions. Funeral inscriptions for married women use language emphasizing their subordination to husbands. The archaeological record shows the transformation in real time. Early Republic inscriptions frequently mention women as property owners and legal actors. Late Republic inscriptions describe them primarily through relationships to men. Women didn't stop wanting autonomy. They stopped having legal mechanisms to claim it. Here's the evidence that makes this undeniable. We have marriage contracts from Roman Egypt spanning 5 centuries, preserved by desert climate. Early contracts from the 1st century BCE frequently include clauses protecting wives' property rights and limiting husbands' authority. By the 2nd century CE, these clauses have virtually disappeared. Instead, contracts emphasize husbands' control, wives' obedience, and fathers' authority to arrange marriages without daughters' consent. The transformation isn't gradual, it's systematic. As Roman law expanded across the empire, it brought with it the legal architecture that stripped women of autonomy, but the erasure went beyond legal reform. It extended to historical memory itself. When later Christian Roman writers described marriage, they presented conventional patriarchal marriage as eternal and natural, ignoring centuries when alternative forms existed. When medieval scholars studied Roman law, they accepted later commentators' dismissal of usus marriage as primitive, rather than investigating why it was eliminated. When Renaissance humanists celebrated Roman civilization, they praised Roman marriage for its stability and hierarchy, never questioning why women had once possessed rights that later disappeared. The historical narrative became a tool of continuing oppression, presenting women's subordination as timeless rather than as the product of specific political choices made by identifiable men. The long-term consequences were civilizational. Roman marriage law became the foundation for European legal systems. Medieval Christian marriage adopted Rome's hierarchical model completely. English common law explicitly stated that married women had no legal existence separate from their husbands, the doctrine of coverture that persisted until the 20th century. Property rights, contract rights, legal personhood itself, all denied to married women across Western civilization for 2,000 years, based on legal architecture that Rome constructed by systematically eliminating alternatives that once granted women autonomy. And here's what makes this erasure so complete. Most people who study Roman history never encounter usus marriage. It doesn't appear in textbooks, it's barely mentioned in university courses. Popular histories of Rome describe marriage as uniformly patriarchal, as if no alternatives ever existed. The scholarly literature acknowledges usus marriage existed, but treats it as a curious footnote, an archaic practice that naturally evolved away as Roman society became more sophisticated. That framing isn't neutral. It's ideological. It presents women's loss of autonomy as progress rather than as deliberate political suppression. Read the sources that do survive, legal fragments, brief mentions in commentaries, oblique references in letters. The pattern becomes unmistakable. Women fought to maintain usus marriage. They used the trinoctium clause. They structured their living arrangements to preserve legal independence. They resisted conventional marriage even as social pressure intensified. And men, fathers, husbands, senators, legal scholars, worked systematically to close every avenue of resistance until none remained. This wasn't cultural evolution. This was political warfare fought through legislative reform, and women lost. But here's the part that should disturb you most. The erasure was so successful that when modern feminists began demanding married women's property rights in the 19th century, they had to argue for them as novel innovations rather than as restoration of rights women had once possessed. The activists fighting for the Married Women's Property Acts had no idea Roman women had held similar rights for centuries before systematic legal reform stripped them away. The historical memory had been so thoroughly destroyed that women had to reinvent autonomy from scratch, facing arguments that such rights were radical departures from Western legal tradition. The tradition itself was a lie. The radical departure was the elimination of women's autonomy, not its restoration. This changes everything we think we know about the supposedly progressive trajectory of Western civilization. The standard narrative presents women's rights as steadily expanding from ancient oppression toward modern equality. But when you examine Roman marriage law, when you track the systematic elimination of usus marriage, when you read the legal commentators celebrating women's loss of autonomy as social improvement, what you see is something much darker. You see that women once held rights that were deliberately taken away. You see legal mechanisms for female autonomy intentionally destroyed. You see a civilization that could have chosen equality instead choosing subordination, then erasing the evidence that choice had ever existed. The definitive truth is this. Usus marriage wasn't a primitive custom that naturally disappeared as Rome became more civilized. It was a radical legal institution that recognized married women as autonomous persons, and Rome systematically destroyed it because female autonomy threatened male power. The hidden ritual Rome tried to erase wasn't mysterious or occult. It was simple cohabitation that women used to maintain legal independence, and that independence was so threatening to patriarchal authority that 3 centuries of legal reform were necessary to eliminate it. The erasure wasn't incidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and reinforced through legal documentation, social pressure, and historical narrative. And it worked so well that 2,000 years later, most people have no idea Roman women ever possessed rights their civilization spent centuries destroying. If you've learned anything from this investigation into marriage law as political suppression, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're going to keep uncovering the uncomfortable truths about how rights once granted can be systematically eliminated, then erased from historical memory so completely that their absence seems natural and inevitable. The machinery of oppression is always more deliberate than we want to believe, and the warning signs are always visible to anyone willing to read the surviving fragments carefully. So what other hidden institutions has history deliberately obscured? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.